From the moment she first slid into a flight simulator seat at 16, Mariah Thompson felt the hum of possibility beneath her fingertips. The drone of turbines and the soft glow of instrument panels became as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Growing up in a small Texas town, she'd watched planes arc across endless blue skies from the tailgate of her uncle's pickup truck, dreaming of the moment she'd be at the controls instead of a passenger. Her mother, a school teacher, saved every tax refund for flying lessons, and Mariah spent weekends memorizing lift equations and navigation charts, her determination taking shape with each logged hour in the air. By 24, she'd earned her commercial pilot's license with honors, lauded for her calm under pressure during crosswinds and emergency drills. She joined Skylink Airlines as one of their youngest first officers, quickly winning praise from captains and flight attendants alike for her meticulous pre-flight checks and clear, confident radio calls. Passengers learned to relax when they heard her voice over the intercom, clear, warm, unwavering. Then, one morning before dawn, Mariah arrived at the hangar to find a terse notice pinned to her locker. License revoked pending investigation. The accusation was nebulous. Failure to comply with procedural standards, yet bore no specifics. Her calls to the FAA office went unanswered, and Skylink removed her from the roster. Overnight, her carefully built reputation turned to rumor. Whispers that she'd cut corners, that her safety record wasn't what it seemed. The shock of being grounded felt like free fall, as if the sky itself had closed off. In the weeks that followed, she pored over her own flight logs and maintenance reports, searching for any sign of error. Every page affirmed her rigor, every entry a testament to her vigilance. But no amount of personal proof could undo the FAA's silence. Grounded and stripped of her wings, Mariah faced the weight of her own doubts. Could the same institution she'd honored with perfect logs wield its power to erase her career on a shadow of suspicion? And yet, deep beneath her uniform's crisp collar, the memory of those first simulator hums and the sky's endless invitation ignited a spark she refused to let be extinguished. Mariah's days as a grounded pilot blurred into a monotony of phone calls and unanswered emails. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the yellowing FAA notice that had stripped her of a career she'd loved since childhood. Each attempt to reach her assigned investigator ended in voicemail. Each letter she sent vanished into bureaucratic limbo. Without her uniform or wings, Mariah felt adrift. Her mornings had once begun with pre-flight briefings and cockpit checklists, and now they began with an anxious scroll through regulations and case law. To stay sharp, she built a makeshift cockpit in her garage, an old yoke from a flight school sale, a stack of navigation charts spread across the hood of her car, and a laptop running simulator software nights on end. She rehearsed emergency descents, engine-out procedures, and radio communications, until her call sign crackled with practiced authority. But simulation couldn't replicate the rush of wind across a wing or the weight of real lives in her hands. Meanwhile, rumors swirled in Skylink's break rooms. Captains whispered that Mariah had lost her nerve, while others speculated about maintenance discrepancies that had to be her fault. A few sympathetic colleagues slipped her supportive messages, reminders that her safety record had been flawless. But most conversations shut down when her name surfaced. Skylink's HR refused comment, and her once friendly schedule coordinator stopped returning her calls. Under the weight of silence, Mariah began documenting every detail of her struggle. Phone logs, copies of emails, witness statements from instructors who had observed her impeccable technique. She filed a formal appeal, attaching performance reviews that praised her professionalism and letters of commendation from satisfied passengers. But each week brought only a new pending review, and her hope gave way to frustration. One evening, as she combed through maintenance reports from the fleet, she noticed an anomaly. Flight 412's engine oil pressure sensor, the one she had flagged in her pre-flight checklist, had been replaced only after her scheduled flight, an entry buried in the maintenance log's fine print. Her heart pounded. If she could prove that the sensor had been faulty before her flight, and that she had dutifully reported it, she might force the FAA to re-examine their case. Fueled by a renewed purpose, Mariah spent days retrieving faxed logs from hangar files and interviewing mechanics who remembered her concern. In the glow of her garage cockpit, She rehearsed not just flight maneuvers, but her testimony. The precise moment the sensor had dropped below standard pressure, her careful application of checklist protocols, and her immediate communication with the dispatcher. Each retelling solidified her resolve. She would reclaim her license, not as an act of pride, but as a necessary step to prove the truth and protect every pilot who flew with faulty instruments. And so, armed with reams of evidence and the steeliness that had carried her through storms at 30,000 feet, Mariah prepared to confront the FAA at their own boardroom, ready to transform her bureaucratic ground state into the launch pad for justice. Late one night, Mariah sat at her kitchen island, surrounded by stacks of maintenance logs, printed emails, and yellow-highlighted checklist reports. Above her, the hum of the refrigerator echoed like an idling APU, and the only light came from her laptop screen. She opened a blank document and began to type, a chronological narrative of Flight 412, how she had noted the oil pressure sensor fluctuation during pre-flight, how she had radioed dispatch and slotted monitor next to the checklist item, and how, despite the caution flag, she had completed a safe takeoff and landing. Each sentence was precise and unemotional, a pilot's report translated into a story for anyone to understand. When the draft covered every detail, she recorded herself reading it aloud, overlaying screenshots of the actual logbook entries and animated captions that tracked the sensor's dip below minimum PSI. She edited in cockpit audio from a training flight that matched her description of the procedure and exported the finished video to her YouTube channel under the simple title, Flight 412, A Pilot's Case for Truth. Then, before sleep could erode her resolve, she hit publish. By morning, the video had already racked up hundreds of views from aviation enthusiasts and professional forums like AvGeek Network and Pilots Digest. Comments poured in from other pilots who had faced unfair reviews, mechanics who recognized the sensor serial number, and even Skylink colleagues urging her to keep pushing. A well-known flight instructor with thousands of followers reposted the video on Instagram, praising Mariah's courage. That afternoon, a regional news outlet called requesting an interview. As the sun set, she found herself explaining her story on live television. The importance of accurate instrument readings, the silent hazards pilots manage, and the human cost when agencies revoke hard-earned credentials without transparent process. Across town at the FAA's regional office, the clipped voices of investigators trembled through phone lines. The supervisor ordered an immediate audit of the maintenance logs and summoned Mariah to a provisional hearing. Flyers for her interview appeared on aviation school bulletin boards, and her YouTube channel doubled its subscribers overnight. When she received the formal notice, complete with a tentative date for the hearing, she closed her laptop and took a deep breath. The sky still awaited her verdict, but now she had allies in the air and on the ground, watching, listening, and ready to fly alongside her toward the justice she had logged in, every instrument check and every word she'd shared. When Flight 529 took off from Dallas under heavy overcast, Mariah was reassigned as a relief pilot. Her stripes hidden beneath a provisional badge, her license still under review. She had volunteered, trusting her instincts. Midway over the plains, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. Engine 2 oil pressure dropping. Prepare for possible diversion. The co-pilot's knuckles whitened on the yoke as the warning light flashed. Mariah slipped on her headset and joined the call. Copy that, Captain. I'll run through the emergency checklist. As they descended toward the nearest airport, turbulence rattled the cabin, and passengers gripped armrests. Mariah's mind raced through every procedure she'd practiced, securing the failed engine, adjusting fuel flow, communicating with ATC to clear a priority approach. She monitored the instruments, oil pressure dipping ever closer to zero, temperature climbing. The built-in simulation in her garage felt nothing like this raw reality. When the crew initiated the single-engine landing, the runway lights struggled to pierce the storm. Mariah called out each step, her voice calm but firm, guiding the aircraft onto the glide slope. As they crossed the runway threshold, a fierce gust threatened to shear them off course. Drawing on muscle memory and the precise sensor data she'd uncovered, Mariah compensated with corrective rudder inputs and slight throttle adjustments from the healthy engine, holding the fuselage steady until the tires kissed the wet tarmac. The cabin erupted in relieved gasps as the plane rolled safely to a stop, Emergency crews swarmed the wings, but nobody needed to evacuate. News of the flawless single-engine landing spread instantly. The same pilot whose license had been revoked had just saved 142 lives. Media outlets hailed her bravery and skill, and the FAA, facing mounting public pressure, announced a full review of their revocation procedures, promising transparency and stricter oversight to prevent future injustices. In one decisive flight, Mariah had not only proven her own competence under fire, but had compelled an agency to reform the very rules that had grounded her. The morning after the emergency landing, Mariah awoke to a barrage of missed calls and voicemail notifications. News crews that had trailed Flight 529's rescue broadcast invites for interviews, while Skylink's corporate communications team requested an urgent statement. But her priority was the FAA hearing, now fast-tracked in light of the public outcry. Arriving at the FAA's austere regional office, Mariah passed rows of gray cubicles and steely conference rooms. Inside the hearing chamber, the same panel that had revoked her license, two senior investigators, a legal counsel, and the department's chief safety officer awaited her testimony. This time, however, they wore tense expressions, the glow from their tablets revealing news headlines applauding Mariah's heroism. A small audience of fellow pilots, mechanics who had vouched for her, and a representative from the airline industry press filled the benches behind her. When the chief safety officer opened with procedural formalities, Mariah steadied herself and delivered a clear, composed account of the Flight 412 sensor anomaly, how she had flagged the faulty oil pressure gauge before takeoff, how maintenance had logged the replacement only afterward, and how that same vigilance had guided her during Flight 529's engine-out emergency. She submitted the maintenance logs, her recorded cockpit audio, and testimonials from mechanics and captains alike. Then, with quiet authority, she recounted the precise control inputs that had steadied the failing aircraft in heavy crosswinds. As she spoke, the investigators exchanged looks of mounting concern. The general counsel shifted in his seat, thumbs scrolling through her submitted evidence. When Mariah finished, a heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint hum of air vents. The chief investigator cleared his throat and asked the airline representative present whether Skylink intended to endorse Mariah's return to flight status. The representative rose and answered simply, "After reviewing her performance data and the landing record, we fully support Ms. Thompson's reinstatement." That moment marked the turning point. The FAA panel recessed to deliberate, and when they returned, the chief safety officer's posture was markedly more contrite. He formally rescinded the revocation notice, returning Mariah's license with an apology for the untenable handling of her case. He announced an immediate revision to the agency's procedural review. Any pilot's license action would require notification of alleged maintenance faults before flying status was suspended, and a mandatory interim hearing within 7 days of any revocation. As the gavel fell, Mariah's colleagues rose in applause. Mechanics who had stood behind her, flight instructors who had mentored her, even the skeptical captain of Flight 529, who offered a heartfelt handshake. In the hallway afterward, an FAA training officer introduced himself and asked if Mariah would join their new safety oversight committee as a subject matter expert, helping to rewrite policy and train investigators on pre-flight query protocols. Walking into the sunlight, license back in hand and reforms already in motion, Mariah felt the full arc of her journey. Grounded by opaque rules, soaring through courage under fire, and ultimately steering an entire regulatory system toward transparency and fairness, she knew the sky would always beckon her return, but now every pilot could land with the confidence that a moment's vigilance would never be unfairly silenced again. In the weeks that followed her reinstatement, Mariah found herself summoned back to the very halls where she'd once faced silence. Now, instead of a lone pilot in dispute, she entered as a recognized expert, invited to sit on the FAA's newly formed Safety Oversight Committee. In a bright conference room lined with technical diagrams and policy binders, she joined investigators, airline representatives, and maintenance engineers to draft the new rules that would prevent any pilot from being grounded without due notice. At the first meeting, Mariah laid out her vision plainly. Every time a maintenance fault is alleged, the pilot must be informed before suspension. with clear documentation and a path to respond. She demonstrated the precise language needed in notifications, specific dates, sensor readings, and reference to the exact checklists involved. She also pressed for timelines, a preliminary hearing within 7 days, and a decision on interim flying status within 14. Around her, the FAA staff, once distant bureaucrats, leaned in, taking notes on the tablets they'd used to review her case. Over subsequent sessions, Mariah worked with drafting attorneys to translate her bullet points into regulatory text. She argued for an appeals process that included an independent safety board, ensuring pilots could present evidence without fear of prolonged grounding. She collaborated with human factors specialists to create training modules, walking investigators through real cockpit simulations, where false sensor readings could be flagged and escalated properly. One afternoon, she led a workshop on the 412 sensor anomaly, using a mock cockpit setup to illustrate how pre-flight reports should trigger immediate maintenance reviews, and how those findings should flow back to pilots in clear written form. Engineers from the FAA's Technical Center tested scenario-based drills she'd designed, running through cases of low oil pressure, false warnings, and delayed maintenance logs. Each exercise underscored the human cost of miscommunication and the necessity of procedural fairness. As the committee's draft regulations neared completion, Mariah addressed a plenary session of FAA regional directors. She spoke not as a disgruntled claimant, but as a steward of aviation safety. Our goal is not to ease pilots' burdens, but to strengthen the entire system. When every pilot knows they will be heard, every crew benefits, and every flight is safer. Her words resonated in the hushed auditorium, and applause followed. When the FAA finally published the new rulebook, complete notification and interim flying status procedures, Mariah saw her fingerprints on every paragraph. As she stepped out of the headquarters building into the afternoon sun, she felt the weight of responsibility transform into quiet pride. She had not only reclaimed her own career, but refashioned the rules so that no future pilot would be grounded without the chance to answer the call. When Mariah strapped into the left seat of Flight 7, 42 weeks after the new FAA procedures took effect, she felt a familiar rush of purpose. As the captain, she logged into the flight plan system and noticed a recent note in the maintenance feed, an entry flagged under the new Pilot Notification Protocol. A minor hydraulic fluctuation had been recorded on Flight 631 2 days earlier, and the pilot on duty had received an immediate digital alert, complete with sensor data and a direct link to the maintenance work order. Thanks to that timely notification, the issue had been addressed before it could develop into anything serious. On the climb out, Mariah reflected on how vastly different the sky felt. Gone were the ghostly fear and bureaucratic uncertainty that had once grounded her without warning. Now, pilots nationwide carried a guarantee that their voices would reach maintenance logs and decision makers before any license action could be taken. Across the industry, preliminary reports showed a 40% reduction in unreported mechanical anomalies and a drastic drop in pilots' emergency appeals. Midway over the Rockies, Mariah received an unexpected message on her cockpit tablet. A thank you from Captain Reynolds, a veteran first officer who'd been part of her original grounding hearing. He wrote that the new rules had saved his career when a faulty altimeter reading, once dismissed as transient noise, was now being reviewed before risking his license. Mariah tapped out a quick reply, encouraging him to keep flying steady and safe. That evening, back at the airline's training center, Mariah led a seminar for new first officers. The classroom was filled with faces of diverse backgrounds, women and men, veteran charter pilots, and recent graduates. She walked them through the notification protocol, demonstrating how to inspect their flight logs for maintenance flags and how to escalate concerns through the new FAA portal. When a shy recruit asked how to advocate for themselves under pressure, Mariah shared her own story, how a revoked license had felt like freefall, and how having a chance to speak the truth under the new system had restored not only her wings, but her faith in aviation's commitment to fairness. A month later, at the annual Safety Oversight Committee banquet, the FAA administrator stood to present Mariah with the inaugural Aviation Integrity Award. He praised her bravery under fire and her role in crafting procedures that would Ensure every pilot in our skies is heard before being silenced. As she accepted the crystal plaque, etched with an image of a soaring jet, cheers filled the hall. Among the applauders sat the mechanics who'd testified for her, Skylink executives who'd backed her return, and even the investigators who'd first revoked her license, now applauding her with genuine respect. That night, as she returned home and tucked her plaque on a shelf beside her grandmother's old flight jacket, Mariah thought of the countless pilots who would never know her name, but whose careers would be safeguarded by the rules she'd helped rewrite. In the quiet hush of her living room, she closed her eyes and envisioned every cockpit lit by vigilance, every pilot confident that their voice would echo through the system long before any ground order could fall. And in that promise of shared safety and respect, she found the sky opening before her once more, vast, trusting, and endlessly welcoming.